The infant's cry echoed against stone walls, piercing the mountain air like a blade through flesh. In the pale light of dawn, 5 elderly men stood in a circle on the western slope of Mount Tegetos, their crimson cloaks snapping in the wind that swept down from the peaks. The child was 5 days old. His mother had bathed him in wine as tradition demanded to test his constitution. He had survived. Now came the second test, the one that mattered. The Gerousia, the Council of Elders, held absolute authority over this moment. They were not doctors or priests. They were warriors who had survived 6 decades of Sparta's brutal reality. Men whose bodies bore the scars of countless battles. Their faces showed no emotion as they examined the squirming infant laid naked on the cold stone before them. One elder, a man named Brasidas, who had fought in the wars against Messenia, lifted the child by his ankles. The baby screamed louder. Brasidas studied the leg, the angle of the foot, the muscle tone in the tiny calf. He passed the infant to the next elder, who inspected the chest, counting ribs, measuring the width of the shoulders with his weathered fingers. A third pried open the baby's mouth, searching for any deformity that might impair speech or breathing. The mother stood 30 paces away, held back by 2 Spartan warriors. Her name was Kyra. She was 19 years old, and this was her first child. She could not speak. She could not plead. To do so would bring shame upon her household and doom her son regardless of the council's decision. She could only watch as these 5 old men determined whether her child would live or die. Her fingernails cut crescents into her palms. Blood trickled down her wrists unnoticed. The inspection lasted 7 minutes. 7 minutes of methodical examination while the infant's screams grew ragged. Finally, the eldest of the council, a man named Ligurgan, who claimed descent from the legendary lawgiver himself, raised his hand. The other elder stepped back. In the sudden silence, broken only by the wind and the baby's harsh breathing, Ligurgan spoke a single word. The word was not recorded in any text, but every Spartan knew it. Every mother had nightmares about it. It was the word that decided whether a child would be raised as a warrior of Sparta or whether his small body would be cast into the gorge known as the Apothete, the place of rejection, where the mountain would claim him as it had claimed thousands before. This movement, multiplied across generations, created the most feared military force in ancient Greece. But at what cost? This isn't Hollywood fiction or patriotic myth. This is documented history, preserved in the writings of Plutarch, Xenophon, and archaeological evidence that still haunts the slopes of Mount Tegetos. This was a eugenic experiment 2,000 years before the word existed. Kyra's infant was not the first child examined that morning, and he would not be the last. The year was 412 BC. What began as practical military necessity had evolved into something far more calculated, far more systematic, and far more terrifying. This was industrial-scale human selection, enforced by law, sanctified by religion, and accepted as normal by a society that measured success in survival rates and battlefield victories. In the gorge below, where eagles circled and shadows never fully lifted, the mountain kept its secrets. To understand how Sparta became a society that killed its own children as state policy, we must first understand the world it inhabited. The Peloponnesian Peninsula in the 8th century BC was a landscape of competing city-states fighting for survival. But Sparta faced a unique and terrifying problem: numbers. Around 730 BC, Sparta invaded and conquered the neighboring region of Messenia. The Messenians, now called Helots, became state-owned slaves. They worked the land, produced the food, and did all the labor that kept Sparta functioning.
But here was the terrifying mathematics Spartan rulers confronted every day. For every one Spartan citizen, there were approximately 7 Helops. 7 slaves for every master. 7 potential rebels for every warrior. This fundamental imbalance created a siege mentality that would define Spartan culture. The city was not preparing for external invasion, it was preparing for internal uprising. The answer Sparta developed was both simple and horrifying. They would become the most efficient killing machine the ancient world had ever seen. Every male citizen would be a full-time professional soldier, physically perfected and mentally conditioned from childhood. But to create such warriors required more than just training. It required careful breeding. The city had no walls. Its walls, as a king famously said, were its warriors. Sparta stripped away everything that did not serve its singular purpose, producing soldiers. The social structure was rigid. At the top were the Spartiates, the warrior elite. Below them were the perioikoi, free non-citizens who worked as craftsmen and merchants. At the very bottom were the helots, periodically culled through sanctioned murder campaigns called the crypteia. Men ate in communal messes, not with their families. Marriage was for breeding, not companionship. Spartan women, scandalously for the ancient world, trained athletically, competed in games, and owned property. But this was not liberation. It was functional breeding stock management. The state needed healthy mothers to produce healthy warriors, so it gave women just enough freedom to maintain physical fitness. The Spartan education system, the agoge, began at age 7. Boys were taken from their mothers and placed into brutal training companies where food was scarce to encourage stealing and violence was required. They were broken and remade into weapons. But the agoge only shaped those who survived to age 7. Before that came the breeding phase, the systematic program of human selection that began before birth. Their worth was measured in the shape of their bones, the strength of their cries, and the judgment of old men who held life and death in their weathered hands. The morning inspection continued. After Kyra's son, 2 more infants were approved, but the 4th child, a daughter, failed. The elders found her left foot turned inward at an unacceptable angle. Her mother's screams as the child was carried toward the gorge echoed across the mountainside. Kyra heard them and felt her stomach turn. That could have been my son. The system worked because everyone participated. The law was absolute. Kyra had prepared for this day since she first felt movement in her womb. She was the daughter of a Spartiate warrior who had died in battle. Her marriage to Nicandros, a 25-year-old warrior, had been arranged by the ephors, Spartans' elected magistrates. It was purely practical. The wedding itself resembled an abduction. Nicandros and his friends seized her at night, her female relatives feigning resistance. Her head was shaven, and she was dressed in a man's cloak. That night, Nicandros consummated the marriage quickly and without tenderness. He left before dawn. Kyra did not see him again for 2 weeks, but she had conceived. She prayed, exercised daily, and ate carefully, desperate to ensure the life growing inside her would meet the standards of the Gerousia. The labor lasted 14 hours, endured in near silence as was expected. When the infant finally emerged, a boy, the midwife, Theora, cleaned him and performed a quick check. 10 fingers, 10 toes. The limbs appeared straight, but Theora's expression remained neutral. She knew that obvious health meant nothing. The standards were arbitrary and therefore terrifying. On the 2nd day, the child was bathed in wine. He screamed but did not convulse. A good sign, but not a guarantee. For 3 more days, Kyra held her son, nursed him, and memorized his features. She had not named him.
To do so before the inspection would be to tempt fate, to claim ownership over a life that belonged to Sparta. Nicandros visited on the 4th evening. He held the infant awkwardly, examining his son with the same critical eye the Gerousia would use. He handed the child back without comment. He was protecting himself, refusing to form an attachment before the state approved. The walk to Mount Taygetos took 2 hours. Kira was third in line. She watched the first mother's relief and the second mother's agony as her infant girl was rejected and carried toward the gorge. The baby's cries were cut off suddenly. Then, silence. Now it was her turn. A warrior gestured. Kira stepped forward, her legs feeling disconnected from her body. She held out her son. Brasidas took the infant, and Kira's arms felt terribly empty. The inspection began. Each elder examined her son, their weathered hands rough against her soft skin. The infant, who had been calm, began to cry. 7 minutes passed. 8. 9. Kira's heart hammered. Finally, Lycurgan took the infant. He held the child at arm's length, studying him. The infant had stopped crying and stared back with dark, unfocused eyes. For a moment that stretched into eternity, the elder's expression revealed nothing. Then, he wrapped the infant back in his cloth and turned to face Kira. Lycurgan raised his hand. Time stopped. In the silence before speech, Kira understood the true horror of Sparta. This was not war. This was her child's life being measured against abstract standards. He was not a person to them. He was raw material. Lycurgan spoke the word suitable. The infant passed inspection. He would live. Kira took her son back with shaking hands, relief flooding through her so intensely it felt like pain. But mixed with that relief was something else. Horror at what she had just accepted as normal, horror at the mother behind her in line, and horror at the gorge where the small broken bodies of rejected children lay in its depths. She had won this round. But in 7 years, Sparta would take her son again, and this time, it would keep him. The infant inspection on Mount Taygetos was the first checkpoint in a systematic breeding program Sparta maintained for over 400 years. The legal foundation came from the Great Rhetra, the law code attributed to the legendary Lycurgus. Plutarch preserved details of these laws, including the explicit requirement that all newborns be presented to the elders for inspection. It was not optional. The criteria focused on the child being well-built and sturdy, but in practice, the standards were subjective. The elders examined body proportion, checked for deformities, and assessed vigor. But it went beyond simple health. Sparta was attempting to breed a superior warrior class through controlled reproduction. This was eugenics, 2 millennia before the term was coined. Archaeological evidence from the Apothetai provides grim confirmation. Excavations have uncovered deposits of human remains, many of them infants. Forensic analysis confirmed that many were alive when discarded, showing no signs of injury beyond the fall itself. The bones included both malnourished and completely healthy specimens, children who died not because they were sick, but because they failed to meet arbitrary standards. The program extended far beyond infanticide. Spartan law regulated marriage and child-rearing with shocking intrusiveness. The state determined when citizens married based on physical fitness. Men were forbidden to marry until they completed military training. Women were required to maintain athletic conditioning. The goal was explicit: to ensure Spartan children were born from the strongest possible genetic stock. Marriage itself was a breeding arrangement. Once married, couples did not live together. Men resided in barracks, visiting their wives only for procreation. This prevented family bonds from competing with loyalty to the state. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect was wife-sharing. Plutarch describes how an older man with a young, fertile wife was encouraged to introduce her to a younger, more vigorous man for breeding. If a man admired another's wife for her strength, he could request permission from the husband to impregnate her. These arrangements were considered a patriotic duty. The clinical nature of this practice reveals how completely Sparta had reduced human reproduction to livestock management. At Sparta's peak in the 5th century BC, there were approximately 8,000 full Spartiate warriors, but the birth rate was carefully controlled. Sparta suffered from oliganthropia, a declining population throughout its history. This seems paradoxical. The answer lies in the brutal mathematics of selective breeding. By some estimates, as many as 1 in 5 infants may have been rejected. The system was designed to produce quality, not quantity, even at the cost of demographic suicide. The Helots, by contrast, were allowed to breed freely, creating the darkly ironic situation where the enslaved population grew while the citizen population contracted. The system perpetuated itself through indoctrination. Children who survived grew up believing that weakness deserved death and that their own survival proved their superiority. To grieve openly for a rejected child would suggest the elders had made a mistake. The psychological toll must have been devastating. How many women internalized this horror as normal? How many were destroyed by it? The breeding program had unintended consequences. By killing children with minor defects, Sparta may have eliminated genetic diversity. By focusing only on physical traits, they ignored intelligence and creativity. Sparta produced no great philosophers, artists, or scientists. As Aristotle later criticized, the system produced good soldiers, but poor citizens, men who knew only how to fight. This was a sophisticated, deliberately designed system. It worked in the narrow sense that it produced fearsome warriors, but it worked at a cost that ancient sources rarely calculated. The cost in human suffering, in parental grief, in the warping of an entire culture. 7 years passed. Kyra's son, now named Leonidas, grew from infant to child under her mother's deliberately limited care. To show tenderness was to prepare him poorly for the hardness ahead. On the day he turned 7, the E-Force came for him. Kyra did not embrace him. She told him what every Spartan mother told her son: return with your shield or on it. Leonidas walked to the assembly point without looking back. From this moment, he belonged to the state. The eugenics was divided into age groups. The youngest boys, organized into agilia, herds, were supervised by an overseer with absolute authority. The overseer for Leonidas's group, Alcibiades, was a scarred veteran. His first lesson was simple and brutal. He selected 3 boys at random and ordered them to fight each other while the others watched. There were no rules. Alcibiades explained that this was their life now: fighting, pain, victory or defeat. Food was deliberately insufficient. Boys were expected to steal to supplement their rations, but were punished if caught, not for stealing, but for being clumsy. Physical training was relentless. They trained barefoot and shirtless in all weather, building resilience through constant exposure. The most infamous aspect of the eugenics was the crypteia. In their late teens, young Spartans were sent into the countryside with orders to kill Helots at random. This blooded young warriors terrorized the Helot population and stripped away any remaining humanity, teaching boys that life had value only if it belonged to a Spartiate.
Another boy in Leonidas's age group, Aristodemos, did not survive the first year. He was weak, a constant target for abuse. One evening, during a hazing ritual, older boys beat him until he collapsed and died. The others were told this was what happened to the weak. That night, they all trained harder, desperate not to be next. For girls, the system operated differently but toward the same eugenic ends. One such girl was Gorgo. She trained at the gymnasium, running, wrestling, activities unthinkable for girls in other Greek cities. At 14, she was married to a warrior named Lysander. She had been conditioned to believe that bearing strong children for Sparta was the highest achievement for a woman. Her first pregnancy was difficult. The infant, a girl, was born healthy, but the midwife noticed something. Her right hand had 6 fingers. The extra digit was fully formed and functional. The question was agonizing. Would this be considered an imperfection? On the inspection day, Gorgo climbed Mount Taygetos. When her turn came, the elders examined the infant methodically. They reached the hand with 6 fingers. Brasidas, still serving on the council, flexed each finger. All moved correctly. But after conferring, Lycurgon, now in his 80s, made the final decision. He raised his hand and spoke the word, reject. The extra finger, functional though it was, marked her as imperfect. Gorgo did not scream. She had been trained for this. But something broke inside her. As an elder carried her daughter toward the gorge, Gorgo watched, her face a frozen mask. Within 6 months, she was pregnant again. Over 16 years, she bore 7 children. 3 were rejected at inspection. 4 survived. Of those 4, 2 boys died in the augagy. 1 boy and 1 girl reached adulthood. This was considered a successful reproductive record. The system consumed adults too. The practice of wife-sharing created its own suffering. A woman named Alpha, whose husband was too old to produce vigorous sons, was informed she would be impregnated by a younger warrior. She was not consulted. Her feelings were irrelevant. Her body existed for the state. These stories multiplied across generations, creating a society where human reproduction was entirely controlled by state interests. And by the late 5th century BC, Sparta's population was declining noticeably. The very program designed to produce superior warriors was slowly strangling Sparta. In 371 BC, 50 years after Kyra watched her son pass inspection, Sparta faced a crisis that would shatter its warrior society. At the Battle of Leuctra, the Theban general Epaminondas, who had studied Spartan tactics, found their weaknesses. The Spartans were predictable, inflexible, and their numbers were too low to replace losses. He developed a new formation, concentrating his best troops into a massive column that punched through the Spartan line. In less than 2 hours, 400 Spartiates died, a quarter of the entire citizen population. Among the dead was Leonidas, Kyra's son, now 42 years old. He died in the front ranks, refusing to retreat. Kyra, now in her 60s, received the news without visible emotion, as expected. But in private, she wept for the first time since that day on Mount Taygetos. The breeding program that had claimed her son at 5 days old, then at 7 years, had finally taken him for good. The defeat triggered a cascade of consequences. Messenia won its freedom, and the helots who sustained Sparta's economy were gone. Sparta's agricultural and economic systems collapsed. But deeper was the demographic reality. With only 1,100 full citizens left, Sparta could not field the armies it needed. Desperate measures followed. The inspection standards were relaxed. A woman named Panthea argued before the elders that her son, born with a clubfoot, could still fight and die for Sparta. The irony was bitter. For centuries, Sparta had killed children for far less. Now, facing extinction, it was considering whether survival mattered more than purity. The elders debated for hours, but ultimately rejected Panthea's son. Even in crisis, they could not abandon the standards. The breeding program had become so fundamental to Spartan identity that changing it felt like a betrayal. Sparta's decline was slow but inevitable. In 331 BC, a Spartiate named Agis IV attempted radical reforms, including ending the infant inspections. He was executed by the system he tried to save. His death demonstrated that Sparta would rather die as it was than survive as something different. The archaeological record shows the infanticide continued even as Sparta's population collapsed. The machine kept running as it ground Sparta to dust. The final blow came in 222 BC, when Macedonian forces crushed Sparta at the Battle of Seleucia. The remaining Spartiates, fewer than 700, were defeated. Sparta was occupied. The eugenics was disbanded. The breeding program finally ended, not through enlightened reform, but through military defeat. What remained was ruins and memory, a memory carefully curated, emphasizing glory while ignoring the systematic child murder. Kyra died in 367 BC, 4 years after her son fell at Leuctra. She was buried in a simple, unmarked grave. Her life, like countless others, was considered unremarkable. But her story, multiplied by thousands, tells the real history of Sparta's breeding program. A society that decided human worth could be measured and found thousands wanting. A culture that chose death and decline over admitting its foundational beliefs were wrong. In the decades following its collapse, Sparta lingered as a shadow of its former self. The breeding program, though officially ended, left consequences that rippled through generations. By 200 BC, the Spartiate population had shrunk to fewer than 700. Each rejected infant represented the erasure of an entire potential lineage. With the Helots gone, Sparta's economy collapsed. The Spartiates, who had never learned to farm or practice trades, now faced starvation. Some became mercenaries, a psychologically devastating descent from men raised to believe they were superior. For the victims of the program, there was no justice, no reckoning. Sparta's culture of stoicism prevented any public processing of the trauma. Yet, small cracks appeared in the facade. A grave marker from the late 3rd century BC commemorates a child taken too soon by cruel judgment, a phrase suggesting the family did not accept the system's legitimacy.
The broader Greek world watched Sparta's decline with mixed feelings. Most ancient writers, however, rarely connected the decline to the breeding program. Infanticide was either ignored or mentioned without moral judgment. For centuries, historians and philosophers who admired Sparta's discipline glossed over or justified the program. Only in recent decades have scholars begun to confront its centrality. Modern archaeology has been crucial. The remains of hundreds of infants in the Taygetos Gorge are material proof of infanticide on a scale ancient writers preferred not to emphasize. The legacy of Sparta's breeding program is a dark one. Nazi Germany explicitly cited Sparta as a model for its own eugenic policies. More pervasively, Sparta contributed to the idea that human worth can be measured and that the collective good can justify individual suffering. The final official act came in 146 BC, when Rome conquered Greece. Roman authorities formally prohibited the remaining Spartan practices. The Taygetos Gorge finally fell silent. The 400-year experiment in human selective breeding was over. What remained was a contested memory. Today, the ruins of ancient Sparta are sparse, but the gorge remains, a deep cleft in the limestone, a place once dedicated to death. The legacy of Sparta's breeding program raises questions that remain relevant today. Modern archaeology has been crucial. The remains of hundreds of infants in the Taygetos Gorge are material proof of infanticide on a scale ancient writers preferred not to emphasize. The legacy of Sparta's breeding program is a dark one. Nazi Germany explicitly cited Sparta as a model for its own eugenic policies. More pervasively, Sparta contributed to the idea that human worth can be measured and that the collective good can justify individual suffering. The infant bones in the Taygetos Gorge do not speak. The mothers who climbed that mountain in terror left no writings. History has silenced the victims, but archaeology gives them a voice. The bones tell us that real children died, that real suffering occurred, that the cost of Sparta's glory was measured in small bodies broken against stone. No amount of military glory, no degree of discipline, no perfection of the warrior ideal was worth what was done to them. Some costs are simply too high. Sparta learned this lesson too late. The stones remember what humans prefer to forget. May we have the courage to listen.